So at the end of class last time, we were looking at verse 6, where the Hebrew author says, "Without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him." And so the idea that he is trying to communicate there is not only that faith is in unseen things, as he says in the first verse of the chapter, but also that without that faith, we can't please God, partly because if we don't have faith in him, we're not going to do the things he has told us to do, especially if we don't believe, number one, that he is, that he exists, or that he rewards those who seek him. Not that we serve for a reward specifically, but that there is a reward in serving him. And that's one of the aspects that the author is going to highlight with not only Noah, but also with Abraham and the patriarchs as he moves into the middle part of the chapter, as he is discussing those who by faith gained their approval or their testimony before God of their faithfulness to him and their trust in his promises. So the example of faith that Noah gives us, he's the last of the pre-flood figures that are mentioned in the chapter. And he is spoken about specifically about what he did by his faith in regard to the warnings that God gave him. So he says there in verse 7 of Hebrews 11, "By faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith." So the faith that Noah has leads him to do what? Build an ark. And why? Why does he build the ark? God told him to. And why did he need to build the ark other than God telling him to? A flood was coming. And so the catalyst for his faithfulness was based on the warning that God gave him of the coming flood and his trust that this thing he had never seen before, a flood that would cover the whole earth and kill all who are outside of this ark, that he trusted that if God said that was going to happen, it was going to happen. There are some who speculate that it might not have even rained before the flood began. They point to in Genesis the description of how the ground was watered by dew and by the rivers that God created in the creation. And even if there was rain in the time of Noah and those before the flood, never a flood like the one he's describing had been experienced. And so he does this because he reveres or he fears God, and he knows that if God says this thing is going to happen, it is going to happen. Robert.
I was just going to say, that big word you use, that's a big word, that word trust. That is a huge word. You know, I mean, we have faith, we have all of these things, but if you don't have to trust to move and do it.
Right. And that trust, when you read the account in Genesis 6, 7, and 8, as he's preparing the ark and preparing to go into the ark, each time the summary is given of what Noah does following God's commands to him and his instructions to him, it always says he did all that God commanded him. And he did that because he trusted in God. He trusted what God said was going to take place. And so because of his faithfulness, he and those that were within the ark with him, his household, so his three sons and their wives and his wife, as well as the animals that God had directed to go to the ark and the food that was within the ark, all of those things are preserved within the ark during the flood. To the point where when he is spoken of in the letter of 1 Peter and chapter 3, Peter uses Noah and his faithfulness and his salvation in the faithfulness in obeying God's commands. He uses that as a contrast or as a type to explain how baptism, how we are saved through baptism. So when we look at verse 20 of 1 Peter 3, he speaking there says, "Who once were disobedient," referring to those that were in prison, "when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah." So those that are kept in prison, he's referring there to those who perished in the flood, who did not listen to the warnings of God before the flood came, like Noah did. So during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water, corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. So there the waters of the flood that cleansed the earth of those that were sinners by their deaths is compared to the waters that we enter into, that we are cleansed spiritually by God through the blood of Christ that we're associated with through baptism. Peter again uses Noah and his example in the 2nd chapter of 2 Peter. In that chapter, he is talking about the coming of false teachers, false prophets, and how their judgment is the same that all false teachers and false prophets and ungodly men will fall into, because it is always based around a rejection of God and his authority in favor of sin. And in verse 5, he refers to the ancient world, and he says of God's judgment on that ancient world, he says that he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, or herald of righteousness, that could be translated, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So this idea of Noah being a preacher or herald of righteousness, that in his faithful deeds, in his faithful living, and I believe in the time while he was constructing the ark, that he was warning people of what was to come and saying that they needed to repent so that they could escape that fate as well, that they would not die but be able to be spared as he and his family were going to be. But of course, no one would have listened to him in that generation. From what we see in the account in Genesis, it was just him and 7 other humans that were saved in that. And so by his faith in God, his faith in the fact that there is a God and that there would be a reward in serving him, that reward being the salvation of his household as the world was condemned, he says, if we go back to Hebrews 11, at the end of verse 7, he says that he became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So that righteous approval, or that righteous testimony based on his faith and faithful deeds and his trust in God, that we still think of Noah and speak of Noah as being a man of great faith and obedience, because he didn't walk with the world or fear the world, but he feared God and sought his pleasure by keeping all that he commanded him to do. So the transition between verse 7 and 8, now we come to focus on the family of Abraham. And he's going to talk about Abraham, about Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Jacob's sons from verse 8 through about verse 22. And so this next large chunk he's going to spend focusing on Abraham, because Abraham's the one who received promises from God. So we have to remember that one of the themes that's been running through the book of Hebrews is how we have a better covenant and better promises now in Christ. And so he is using this example because by faith, Abraham received promises from God and received those things, though not all of them in his lifetime. So of the promises Abraham was given, what's the only one he actually received during his life? He received the son that was promised to him. He received Isaac. And so the blessings that God gave him throughout his life, and specifically in giving him the promised son, Isaac, God was showing him that he would keep all the promises. And that's really the argument that the Hebrew author is going to use about Abraham and Sarah. So in verse 8 of Hebrews 11, he says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." So he gives this initial statement about the faith of Abraham. And it begins with those first promises that God makes. So the first promise being that he would give him a land that he would show him, that he would give him many descendants that would become a nation, and that he would have from that nation come one child, one offspring that would be a blessing to all nations and families of the earth. But what was the first thing Abraham had to do to be able to get any of those things? He had to obey. He had to leave his father's house and his land and go to the land that God was going to show him. So a place he had never seen. He didn't know that it was going to be the land of Canaan that he was going to go to. He had to trust God enough to leave. And it says that that's what he did, that he obeyed the voice, the call that God gave him to receive this inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. And even then, when he gets to the land, if we go over to Genesis and the 12th chapter there, when he gets to the land and God tells him that this is the land that he is going to receive. In chapter 12 and in verse 5. So Genesis 12 and verse 5, Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his nephew and all their possessions which they had accumulated and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. So he travels from the northern part of the land of Canaan down to the southern part, and he builds these two altars to worship God in the land, because he's trusting that even though the Canaanites live in the land, even though it's not his, that while he's living in those tents, that it will be his descendants' land one day. So that faithfulness continues throughout Abraham's life. It's not until his wife Sarai dies that he purchases a cave in which to bury her in the land, in that hope that God would give them the land one day. And that's the cave of Machpelah that he buys. And that even then, he doesn't own land to live in, it's a tomb that he's bought. And so he spends his days in a tent, and not just him, but also his descendants. So he makes mention in verse 9 of how as Abraham lived in the land of promise as a foreigner, as an alien and stranger, dwelling in tents, so also did Isaac and Jacob, who were also heirs of the promise. And this is one of the themes that is going to be brought up again later in the chapter when we talk in verses 20 through 22 about those descendants of Abraham and their faith, in that they pass this promise from father to son. So Isaac receives it from Abraham, Isaac gives it to Jacob, Jacob gives it to the two sons of Joseph, and then the other sons also receive blessings, and they bless their descendants, and so forth. So one of the things the Hebrew author is trying to do is he's trying to help us to understand that the land itself wasn't really the goal. It wasn't the purpose. That yes, God was going to give them that land. It was the land that they would inherit, but it wasn't the land itself that was going to be the true fulfillment of these promises, because all of the promises are to get them to that third promise of the offspring that would be born, that would make all the families and nations of the earth blessed, meaning the Messiah, the Christ. And so he's showing them that all of our history has always been about God bringing that Messiah, who we have had now not only come in the flesh, but die and be raised. And now he, as we've already seen in the letter, ascended on high to the right hand of God in the true sanctuary as our perfect sacrifice and high priest, and as the one who has ensured us not only of eternal life, but of the promises that he can give, that the law and the things of that law could never and were never meant to give us from the Old Testament. So as he's talking about this, he's showing them that the promises were always distant, even when he had Isaac, even when Isaac had Jacob and Esau, even when Jacob had his 12 sons. The promises were still distant to them. And they weren't really dwelling on the distance, because it was already something they were looking forward to beyond the physical things. So verse 10 of Hebrews 11, "For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." Jennifer?
For me, that verse 10, I mean, it's been like a huge persuasive piece we've been reading, and he's been
Right.
with that. And that's the hardest part, I think, for them, is they were doing the right thing. Old Testament was right. They were trying to live and be good Jewish people, but all of a sudden it was ripped out to where now there's something new. But it's not new, because they should have known about it, because of Abraham. So I just think it's really cool the way it's put together.
Right. So he's trying to show them, like he's done throughout the letter, that the way they should read the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures specifically, is through Christ. That they should see how all of that was leading to his coming, his promises, and the kingdom that we not only experience as the church now in part, but one day fully when we are with the Lord. So the now and not yet thing about talking about the kingdom, that the kingdom exists, but we're not fully there yet because we're still living here on the earth. We don't yet see all things under Christ's feet yet in this life, but we will one day. And so again, this goes to that idea of you're looking for something that's still in the distance, but it's as if you already had hold of it.
Well, and the other thing that he mentions, they're undergoing trials. These people underwent trials too.
Right.
And sometimes much worse than what they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And they still pushed forward.
Right. Robert?
Is that like, when they say the hidden treasure that is in God, when it's revealed, is that what we're talking about?
Right, the treasures in heaven or the New Jerusalem, looking towards that reality of getting to dwell with God, having that perfect Sabbath rest that he talks about in chapters 3 and 4 that Christ can give us, that Joshua wasn't able to give the people of Israel. He's got that idea in mind when he says that that's the city they're looking for, is to go and be with God fully. It wasn't so much as, hey, I want this kingdom here on the earth, so much as I want to go to be with the architect and builder that is God in the city that he's prepared for his faithful people.
But isn't the treasure Christ in God? Is that it?
Can you say that again?
Is it that Christ is the treasure that is in God? That's to be revealed?
So the thing that's to be revealed, I'd say you could say it that way, because when he comes in his glory, all will see him, and every knee will bow, every tongue will confess him as Lord on that day. So I would say in that way you could say that, yes. So in verse 11, the Hebrew author now introduces Sarah into the picture. So the first of only 2 women specifically talked about in the text by name, though there are a few who are referenced in different ways. In the faith of Sarah, he says, by faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead, at that as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So the faith of Sarah, why is it that he says that her faith gives her a testimony of God's approval?
I just whispered to him, it's interesting that they said by faith even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive, because she didn't believe she could conceive when she was first old, right? When did she laugh?
Okay, so this is a good question. So when we're looking at the book of Genesis and the 18th chapter, and Abraham has welcomed the angel of the Lord and the 2 other angels, the 2 men who have come, and their message in verse 9 is to ask where Sarah, his wife, is, and he says there in the tent. In verse 10 of chapter 18, he said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. She laughed to herself, saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah denied it, however, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. So she laughs, but why does Moses, when he writes this, why does Moses say she laughed?
It's laughable if you think about it from a earthly standpoint. That would be like telling my mother-in-law she was going to have a child. That's funny because that's not possible. I don't think it's that Sarah denies that it's possible or that she doesn't trust in God enough to have a child. It's just like to hear that out loud as someone advanced in age who thought that's never going to happen. It's like, why would you say that? That's so silly. But
Yeah, I'm going to make sure Mom knows that you said she's as old as Sarah. So Sarah, when she's being told this, she's about 90 years old. But on top of that, she's also barren. Sarah?
She's also laughing at that.
Yes. So there's two ways that you could understand the way it's written in Hebrew. That one, she's like laughing with, like scoffing with scorn of like, there's no way that could happen. But then there's also just the laughter of almost absurdity, like how could that possibly be? So when you hear something that it's so outside of the realm of possibility, you just laugh. And so yes, she is saying, how can that possibly be? I'm so old, my husband is old. She also knows she's barren. And then when God speaking says, why'd she laugh? And she goes, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh. Well, we also have to remember, Abraham does the same thing in chapter 17. The first time God comes and gives him the covenant of circumcision and tells him that it will be through Sarah that he will have this child that is the child of promise, because Abraham says, well, I have this child, Ishmael. Can he be the one that receives the promise? And God's answer to him is that no, it'll be through Sarah that your child, the child of promise, comes. And in verse 17 of chapter 17 in Genesis, it says, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a son? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But God said, no, but Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, which means laughter in Hebrew. It bears a similarity to the word for laughter. And then when we get to the chapter where it records the birth of Isaac, that is what they name her. And she doesn't say because I laughed at God, but because God has made my sorrow, he's made this laughter for me, this joy. And so there is that idea here that their doubt leads them to laugh at the idea that this could be possible, because from a human perspective, this is completely impossible. And God's answer to both of them ultimately is, I'm going to do this. It's not you who's going to do this. And so when she has the child, God shows that he can do the impossible thing, that the unseen things of God can do things that man doesn't expect he can do. So her doubt initially ultimately is shown to have resulted in faithfulness, because we also have this commentary by the author of Hebrews, who is inspired to say that it was by her faith she received the ability to conceive. And I think this is one of the things that is a good reminder for us when we're reading the scriptures, is that none of these people is any different that we're reading about than any of the rest of us except for Christ, because he was fully God and fully man. And so when we're talking about people like Abraham and Sarah, they have their moments of doubt or of weakness in faith, but ultimately their faith over all, that's what God's looking at, is the overarching faith of their life, that he's saying that faith is what gave her that ability, that she trusted in God, and he made it to where she was able to conceive, because he who promised is faithful. And so the faithfulness of God and the faith that people put in him who is faithful is the thing he's highlighting here, that faith that they had in him is what led not only Sarah but also Abraham in their old age to be able to conceive and not just have a child, but ultimately to have an innumerable amount of descendants, which the stars of the heavens quotation there in Hebrews 11 and verse 12 comes from Genesis 15 and verse 5, as well as chapter 22 and verse 17, and 32 and verse 12, where this gets repeated over and over, how many descendants there will be, because it's not just the biological descendants the people of Israel, but ultimately it's the children by faith of Abraham, those who have a faith like him, that are those innumerable descendants of all nations that God had promised Abraham would have. And so one aspect of that nation promise is that, yes, on the one hand, it was about Israel, but it's also ultimately about the spiritual, the true Israel, those who have faith like Abraham, which is the argument Paul makes both in Romans and in Galatians when writing to those churches. So, in verse 13 of Hebrews 11, he gives a summary statement about all of those that he's talked about so far. And really, it even goes towards those who he will talk about after, because all of the people he's going to mention have long since passed away in this life. But he says, all these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. So just that verse alone sounds a lot like the way Peter talks about the Christians that he writes to in 1 Peter 1. He talks about being sojourners, being aliens and strangers on the earth, but living righteously while on the earth. Well, here the Hebrew author is saying this is how God's people have always lived. Even those, as we'll see, who live in the land, ultimately, they also were, those who were living by faith at least, were living as strangers and exiles because they're looking for that kingdom, that nation that is above with God. So he says of them in verse 14, "For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own, and indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." So as he talks about the attitude, the faithfulness of them, he describes the main distinction about the country that they're looking for, the one they're striving to reach. And it's not the one that they left. So when we think about the people of Israel, and specifically here, when we think about the example of Abraham and of his descendants who lived in the patriarchal period, they lived in the land of promise, but they did not own any of it. And they were, as he's already said, not looking for that earthly version of these things. And he said if that's what they were looking for, a home on the earth, so a country here, well, where was that? It was Ur of the Chaldeans. They could have gone back there. They could have gone to Haran. They could have just stayed there in the land and bought some land and just settled in with the Canaanites. So what does that have to do then with the people that this letter was first written to? What has their main struggle been?
I was thinking about when we are comfortable, we're not right with God. We should know this is all, and we get comfortable, right? That it should be like we're wearing a wool sweater in Texas on a 100-degree day. Is what, not that we should be miserable or sad, we're supposed to be joyous and all of that, but things should bother us. And we should understand that the earth has always been this way.
Mhm.
And this isn't where we're meant to end up. And that's why it feels not right. We're never quite comfortable here.
Yeah, there should be that longing for the things that are with God, the things from above. And so when he's writing to these Jewish Christians, some of whom who are being tempted to abandon faith in Christ, which he's already argued in the letter, if you abandon him, you're abandoning everything, because there is no hope to go back to. There is nothing to go back to outside of him, since he's the fulfillment of those things. The temptation that they're facing is, if I give up Christ, life gets a lot easier here and now. And really, that's the same temptation Christians face throughout history, no matter their geographical or political context. If you give up Christ, if you give up looking for those things above, life will get a lot easier in the sense of the persecutions, the uncomfortable interactions we might have in the world, for them, the potential of being thrown in jail or having their property taken away or being put to death, all that just goes away if you stop talking about Jesus. Whether it was coming from a Jewish or a Gentile source, this persecution ends if they stop naming the name of Christ. And when we look at the historical accounts of the persecutions, especially by the Romans, during the first and the following centuries, they were given that choice sometimes at sword point. You know, burn incense to Caesar and to the gods and deny Christ and you'll live, and if you don't, we're going to cut your head off. And some would say, okay, let me go ahead and burn that incense to Caesar. And others refused and were put to death for it. And we know that from writings like those letters of Pliny the Younger, who wrote to the emperor in his day, and the emperor said, hey, that's a great policy, just stick with that. So when we think about this, whether Jewish or Gentile in our background as a Christian, that's still the temptation for us, is we can go back to the life outside of Christ, and things will get easier in that sense, because the persecutions and the pressures and the temptations, well, it's all perfectly fine now to indulge in any temptation once I've done that, as long as it's socially acceptable, right? Josh?
Verse 13 is talking about all the religious talk about they're die without seeing the promises. Well, we're all part of that too. We're going to die without seeing that promise. That promise comes in our death.
Right.
So we're all part of this too. We're welcoming this promise from a distance because we haven't received it yet. We won't receive it until we're gone.
Right. And so having that attitude of looking to the things that are still ahead, and seeing this is the reason I read verse 6 at the beginning, that there is a God and he is a rewarder of those who seek him, that there is a reward for this. So yes, Abraham dies without receiving the land of promise or seeing that nation, but he received the son. And he received the other blessings that God gave him. Because remember, he said that you'll be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And we see those things happen in the accounts of his life. And so we see that God is faithful. And so if they could do that and not receive the promises, and we have better promises than the ones they were looking towards, well, then that should give us all the more reason to trust in God and to endure faithfully to the end, which is ultimately what his argument is that they were not ashamed of their God, and they desired a heavenly home rather than just an earthly one, and the things that come with those things. And so because of that, God is not ashamed, verse 16, to be called their God, or another way that could be rendered is ashamed of them. He's not ashamed of them, because he has a city prepared for them. And so this again goes back to he's a rewarder of those who seek him, and he is not ashamed of those who seek him, even if on the earth they live a life that the world says is shameful, because he has that city prepared for them when they enter into their rest with him. Rachel?
What I was just going to say, and the way this is written out, of course, is perfect, but even more so, these individuals in this church and anyone going forward has an account of example after example after example of people who did not really have examples before them of enduring faithfully through hard times, through things. And this is just a giant encouragement to anyone who's like, well, maybe I'm doubting a little bit. It's like, well, look at Noah, look at Sarah, look at Abraham, who literally had to wait almost 100 years?
25 years.
125 years.
Yeah, 25 years.
25 years, sorry, thank you. For his son. In his old age already, he had been waiting forever.
Right.
And then God's like, oh, you have a son now. I want you to sacrifice him. And Abraham still goes through with that faith, because he believed that God would bring him back to him, regardless.
Okay, so Rachel wants us to go on to verse 17, so we'll go ahead and do that. So in verse 17, he says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So one of my favorite parts of the book of Genesis is Genesis 22, which is what he's talking about here. And how the test of Abraham's faith was, first of all, that God said, you're to go to the land of Moriah, which was a 3 days journey. You're to take your son, your only son, your unique son, is what he's saying there when he says your only begotten son, your monogenes in Greek. So the one who has all the promises on him, you're to take that son and you're to put him to death. You're to offer him to me as a sacrifice. And one of the things about Abraham's faith in that, in him immediately saddling his donkey and taking Isaac and the 2 servants with them, is that he doesn't waver, he doesn't bargain, he doesn't question, he just obeys God. And we're not really told why at first in the Genesis account, but if you look at verse 5 in Genesis 22, which we're going to do on your own time, so we have time to get through this point before we run out tonight. When he gets to the mountain and he leaves the 2 servants behind, he tells them that he and the boy, we're going to go up on the mountain and we're going to worship and we will come back. So he, in that text, already knows that Isaac is coming down the mountain with me, even after I sacrifice him. And it's not until Paul and the Hebrew author later, when they are writing, that we have a place in the scriptures that tells us what that faith was that led him to believe that. It's that he already understood that, first of all, here, the promises are given in Isaac. So that thing we read there in Genesis 17 and verse 17 and following, when God said, no, through Isaac your descendants will be named, it'll be through Sarah that child comes, he knew, well, if God made these promises and God keeps his promises, he's going to keep the promises. Isaac's not going to stay dead. In the Romans account, Paul looks at it from the perspective of, he knew that the God who had made life come out of the death of his body and of his wife's body because of their old age, their bodies were basically dead, is the way that Abraham was thinking of it, that if God could bring life out of that death, well, then he can bring my son back from death to life, even though when you're reading the Bible, there's no account in those first 21 chapters of anyone being brought back to life. So why does he believe that? Because he believes that the God who can do all things, who can bring life out of death, who keeps promises, is faithful. And if he said, I'm going to bless you through your son Isaac, and he will be the one through whom all of these promises come true, he could trust that absolutely, even if his son died, that God would make those things come about, that his son would not remain dead. And that's one of the amazing things about Abraham's faith when you take that step back and you reflect on it here, that he knew that God could do that, even though his only evidence was who God is and the promises God had made. So in verse 19, when he says he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type, he's using that language there of type and antitype to refer back to that other unique son through whom the promises hung, which is Christ. That he's the only other son that is referred to in Scripture as the only begotten of God. He's the only begotten child of God. He's the one that was promised through whom all nations and families would be blessed, and that there would be an eternal kingdom and an eternal throne that he would sit on. And so he's using this to call us back to think about Christ, that if God made that promise in regard to Isaac, and Abraham was faithful, and there was a reward in that, well, then the same is true for those who put their faith in the other son of promise that we gain life through, and that is through the Christ. So, Lord willing, next Wednesday night, we'll continue there in verses 20 and following. The rest of the notes for chapter 11 are on the back tables if you want to pick those up to look at. And I appreciate the comments and the conversation this evening about Hebrews 11.